Hector Vane didn't say a word when he walked into Rowan Mercer's smokehouse that October morning. He just picked up Elena's carefully labeled salt canisters, 3 weeks of her work, and dumped them into the mud outside. Every single one. No woman runs anything on this range, he said, loud enough for every ranch hand to hear. And no drifter girl is going to change that. Rowan stood 10 feet away and said nothing. Elena stood in the doorway, covered in brine and sawdust, watching everything she'd built sink into the dirt. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She looked at Hector with the kind of stillness that made grown men uncomfortable, and then she looked at Rowan, the man who hired her, the man who handed her that key, and she waited. He still said nothing. That moment, that silence, it was the moment that nearly broke everything. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or had someone destroy what you built just to prove a point, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The first thing Elena Breyer noticed about Mercer Ranch was the smell. Not the cattle, not the pine coming off the mountains, not even the cold that had started biting at the edges of every morning that week. It was the smokehouse, that low, dark building sitting apart from everything else at the edge of the property. And it smelled like something left to rot, like wood that had given up, like a room that hadn't been asked to do anything useful in a very long time. She stood at the gate with her travel bag over one shoulder and looked at it for a long moment before she looked at anything else. That told Rowan Mercer everything he needed to know about her. He just didn't know what it meant yet. He was fixing a fence post when she arrived, which was probably the most honest version of himself anyone could catch. Sleeves rolled, hands bleeding from where the wire had gotten him twice, jaw set with the particular kind of tension that comes not from anger but from exhaustion, pretending to be strength. He'd been at it since before dawn. The post still wasn't right. "You the one who posted in town?" she called from the gate. He didn't look up. "Depends who's asking." "Elena Breyer." She let herself through the gate, which he noticed, and walked toward him across the uneven ground without hesitating. "I'm asking about the smokehouse position." He looked up then. She was younger than he expected. Not young enough to be his daughter, but young enough that two of his ranch hands were going to laugh out loud when they saw her, and he already knew it, and already felt the small, dull headache of knowing he'd have to deal with that later. "You have experience?" he asked. "Enough." "That's not an answer." "Then let me see it," she said. "The smokehouse. I'll tell you what I know after I see what you're working with." He should have told her no. He'd been telling himself all week that he needed someone with references, someone local, someone the men would respect without him having to stand over them and make them. He needed simple, and he needed fast because winter in this part of Montana didn't negotiate and it didn't wait. Instead, he pulled the key off his belt loop and pointed. She took the key without a word and walked toward the smokehouse, and he went back to the fence post, and for about 4 minutes he almost convinced himself this was a perfectly reasonable thing to have done. Then he heard the smokehouse door scrape open, and then he heard nothing, and then he heard her voice carry back across the yard, clear and unhurried. "When did you last use this?" "Few years." "How many is a few?" He didn't answer that. She appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Mercer, how many years?" "4," he said. "Maybe closer to 5." She looked back into the dark interior for a moment. Then she looked at him. "And you're trying to prep for winter starting when?" 3 weeks ago, he said, which was honest in a way that cost him something. She was quiet. Not the quiet of someone being polite. The quiet of someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the numbers. "I need full control of the operation," she said finally. "No interference, no second guessing from the hands, no committee. You tell them I'm running it or I'm not running it. That's the only way this works." "You haven't even told me what your experience is." "My father ran a curing operation in Wyoming for 31 years, she said. "I worked beside him from the time I was 7 until the year he died. I know salt ratios for altitude, I know how to manage fire in a compromised chimney, and I can look at that smokehouse and tell you it hasn't been cleaned properly in longer than you're admitting." She paused. "Do you want me to tell you what I know, or do you want to argue about whether I know it?" Rowan pulled the wire tight on the fence post and let it go and watched it spring back crooked. He'd been fighting that post for 2 hours. "You're hired," he said. He thought about it as a practical decision. He told himself it was because she knew what she was talking about, because the winter stores were already behind schedule, because he didn't have better options walking through his gate. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she reminded him of someone he used to be, someone who walked into a broken thing and said, I can fix this before they'd done the math, before they knew the cost, back when certainty still felt like something solid to stand on. He'd lost that somewhere in the last 5 years. He wasn't sure he could afford to let it back in, but he handed her the key anyway. So, the first thing Elena did in the smokehouse was not start working. She stood in the middle of it for 20 minutes with a lantern, touching the walls, checking the chimney draft with a strip of cloth, pressing her thumb into the wood at the base of the hanging racks to test for rot. She was looking at it the way a doctor looks at a patient they've just been handed, not assuming, not rushing to diagnose, just listening to what the structure was telling her. What it was telling her was not good. The flue had a partial blockage about 6 feet up. The hanging racks on the east wall had 3 compromised hooks that would drop whatever you hung on them the moment weight and moisture and heat got involved. The salt shelves had been built at the wrong height for efficient workflow. Whoever designed them had never actually done the work themselves. And the floor had a drainage problem that would turn the whole space into a swamp the first time she got a serious brine operation going. None of this was unfixable. All of it was going to take time she didn't have. She walked back to the yard and found Rowan still at his fence post. I need 2 things, she said. A chimney brush, a long one, and someone who can follow instructions without asking me why every 5 minutes. Rowan stood and pressed one fist into the small of his back. The brush I can get. The other part might be harder. Then get me the brush, she said. I'll manage the rest. What she got, when Rowan sent a hand named Dale over to help that first afternoon, was a man with 40 extra pounds of opinion and about 30 seconds of patience for being told what to do by someone he'd never seen before. Dale was 50-something, had worked Mercer Ranch for 11 years, and made it clear within the first 2 minutes that he considered this arrangement somewhere between insulting and absurd. You want to run that chimney brush yourself? He said, looking at her like she'd told him she planned to shoe the horses with her bare hands. I want to watch how you do it, she said, which was a lie, but a useful one. Dale ran the brush. Elena watched. What she was actually watching was how the blockage broke apart, what direction the debris fell, whether the draft changed the way she expected it to. Dale thought she was deferring to him. She was taking inventory. That's your problem there, Dale said, pulling the brush down and looking at the mess of built-up creosote and old soot on the smokehouse floor. Hasn't been brushed in, Lord, years. 4 or 5, Elena said. Smells like more. It does, she agreed. You're right about that. Dale looked at her. He'd been ready for an argument, and she'd taken it away from him, and he didn't quite know what to do with that. She handed him a broom. Can you sweep while I start on the rack hooks? He swept. He didn't love it, but he swept. That was the first small thing, the first piece of cooperation extracted not through authority, but through the careful management of someone else's ego, which Elena had been doing since she was 9 years old, helping her father deal with men who didn't believe in either of them. The ranch hands learned about Elena. The way ranch hands always learn about things they don't like, gradually, collectively, and with a great deal of commentary conducted at a volume just low enough to be deniable. There were 4 of them besides Dale. Pete, who was young and mean in a small-time way that comes from never having been challenged seriously. Hector Vane, who was older and meaner in a way that had been cultivated over decades and wore a particular kind of authority that Rowan had never quite gotten around to confronting. 2 others named Cal and Jerome, who mostly went whichever way the group went and didn't have strong opinions of their own. Hector was the one to watch. Elena identified him within the first 2 hours on the property, not because he said anything directly, because he didn't, because he was the one standing slightly back from the others, arms crossed, watching her with the particular expression of a man who has already made his decision and is just waiting to act on it. She'd seen that expression before. Her father used to call it a man who's decided the outcome before the game starts. He wasn't wrong. She kept working. The first week was the smokehouse itself, cleaning it, repairing it, making it functional. She worked from early light until after dark, and she did it mostly alone because getting Dale to help a second time required fresh negotiation, and Pete outright ignored the one task Rowan had assigned him in the smokehouse, and Hector never came near the building at all. Rowan checked in each evening. She kept her reports short. "Salt coming tomorrow?" she'd ask. "Should be," he'd say. "The hooks on the east rack need replacement, not repair. I'll put in an order. Make it a fast one." He made it a fast one. That surprised her a little, though she didn't show it. What she was starting to understand about Rowan Mercer was that he was a man who had been making decisions alone for so long that he'd started to mistake that for strength. There was a difference between a man who didn't need advice and a man who had simply stopped expecting anyone worth asking. She wasn't sure yet which kind he was. She kept working. By the end of the first week, the smokehouse was clean. By the end of the second week, the first batch of pork bellies was in brine. She'd sourced the salt herself, drove the wagon into town and negotiated the price herself, and hauled it back without asking for help, because she knew that asking for help with something the hands considered beneath their dignity to assist with would just be a new opportunity for them to demonstrate that dignity at her expense. The brine was right. She knew it was right before she even measured it, the way you know a thing after enough years of doing it, but she measured it anyway because measurements were evidence, and evidence mattered when you were working with people who were looking for reasons to doubt you. She labeled every canister, she made notes on the ratios, she kept records, not because Rowan asked her to, because someday someone might need to replicate this, and she wanted it written down correctly, wanted there to be a document that said this is how it was done, rather than leaving it all inside someone's head where it could die with them. Her father's knowledge had died with him. Most of it. The parts she'd absorbed herself were the only parts left. She wasn't going to let that happen to this work. Rowan ate dinner alone most nights. He'd been eating dinner alone for 3 years since his wife Margaret had packed her things and driven south, and eventually sent a letter explaining she'd gone to live with her sister in Colorado, which was a polite way of saying she'd needed to choose between the ranch and herself, and she'd finally chosen herself. He didn't blame her. He'd thought he would when it happened. He'd expected anger or bitterness, or at minimum some loud interior argument he could have with himself. Instead, there was just a quiet that settled into the house and stayed. He'd gotten used to the quiet. That was the troubling part. He'd gotten so used to it that he stopped noticing when it was too heavy. On the 9th evening, he walked past the smokehouse at dusk and saw the light still burning inside. He stopped. He could hear movement, the soft, careful movement of someone working slowly, deliberately, not rushing. He knocked on the frame. "Come in," Elena said. She was at the work table with one of the pork bellies open in front of her, making a small incision and pressing her fingertips into the flesh to check the salt penetration. She didn't look up when he came in. "Late to be at it," he said. "It's not late. The temperature dropped and I wanted to check the surface cure before I left it overnight." "Is it good?" "It's exactly right," she said. Then she paused and something crossed her face. Not pride exactly, but its quieter cousin. Satisfaction. The look of someone who expected the right result because they did the right work. "Do you want to feel it?" He was not expecting that. "Come here," she said, which was not quite an invitation and not quite an order. "Press 2 fingers here. You should be able to feel where the salt has worked in versus where it hasn't. It should be there. There, feel that? That's uniform penetration. If it were uneven, you'd feel soft spots." He felt it. He didn't entirely know what he was feeling for, but he could sense the difference she was describing. A slight change in resistance, in texture, subtle enough that he'd have never noticed it on his own. "How long does it take to learn that?" he said. "Longer than you'd think," she said. "Years, not months." He stepped back. She covered the belly and made a note in her record book. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "Why did you come here?" he said. "This specific ranch. My posting wasn't exactly, I know it wasn't much. There's bigger operations closer to town." She was quiet for a moment, and he couldn't tell if she was deciding whether to answer or deciding how to answer, which were different problems. "Your posting said the smokehouse had been unused," she said finally. "The other said experienced help needed or good wages. Yours said the smokehouse was cold, and you needed someone who knew what they were doing." She put the cap back on her pen. "I didn't want somewhere that already had a system. I wanted somewhere that needed one." He thought about that. "My father built a curing operation once," she said, "in a place that hadn't had one before. He always said that was the best kind, building something from nothing, instead of inheriting someone else's habits." "He taught you well," Rowan said. Something shifted in her face. Not grief exactly, more like the ghost of grief. The place grief had been after it finally passed through. He did, she said. He said goodnight and walked back to the house, and he ate dinner alone, but the quiet felt different that night. Less like something missing, more like a pause before something began. Hector made his move on a Thursday. Elena had been at the ranch 12 days. The salt stores were coming in. The brining was underway. The smokehouse was functional for the first time in 5 years. She'd started a schedule for the first smoking cycle and had it written up and tacked to the inside of the smokehouse door. Hector walked in, looked at the schedule, and pulled it off the wall. "This isn't how we do things," he said. Elena was in the middle of adjusting a rack hook, and she stopped and looked at him. "Put that back." "You don't get to write orders on this ranch," he said. "You were hired to do a job, not run a department." "Rowan gave me full authority over this operation. He told all of you." "Rowan says a lot of things," Hector said, and there was something in his voice that had been building for 12 days, something that had decided Elena was a problem that needed correcting, and that the correction needed to happen before she got any more established. "He made a foolish hire, and sooner or later he'll know it. I'd rather save him the trouble." He crumpled the schedule, dropped it on the floor, and then he went to the shelf where she'd stored the labeled brine canisters. 3 weeks of work, careful measurements, documented ratios. And he picked up the nearest one. "Hector." Her voice was flat. "Don't." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had already decided and was just waiting for the reaction. He walked to the door and he tipped it into the mud outside. Then the next one. Then the next. She counted. 5 canisters. 3 weeks of work, not all of it, but enough to hurt, enough to set the schedule back, enough to send a message that cost her real time she didn't have. Rowan was at the fence. She could see him from the doorway. He'd heard Hector's voice, and he'd turned, and he was watching. He didn't move. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she could see on his face the thing she'd seen a dozen times in her life on a dozen different faces. The calculation, the conflict, the arithmetic of confrontation versus comfort, of which battle to pick and which to let pass. He let it pass. He looked down and went back to the fence. Elena stood in the doorway of the smokehouse with her hands still at her sides, and the mud soaking those 5 canisters into the ground, and she made herself breathe. She looked at Hector. He looked back at her with something that was not quite triumphant and not quite satisfied, more like a man who'd done what he thought was necessary and had already moved on from it in his own mind. "Are you done?" she said. "For now," he said. He left. She stood there one more minute. Then she went back inside, picked up her pen, opened her record book, and started calculating what it would take to replace what she'd lost. She would not ask Rowan about it. She would not wait for him to fix it. She would fix it herself, and that would be the answer. And when the shelves were full at the end of this and the ranch had everything it needed to survive the winter, the math would be clear, and no amount of spilled brine was going to change it. That was the thing about her father's work, about this work. It was all math in the end. The salt either worked or it didn't. The cure was either right or it wasn't. There was no room for opinion, no space for a man's pride or a man's need to be the one in charge. Reality would settle it. She just had to get there. She replaced what Hector spilled by the following morning. She didn't sleep much. She did the math in her head while she lay in the narrow bunk in the small room Rowan had given her off the back of the main barn, calculated the salt ratio from memory, recalculated it, ran the numbers again because she was tired and tired. People made errors, then got up at 4:30 while it was still dark and cold enough to see her breath, and went back to work. Nobody saw her do it. That was intentional. If she had asked for help, it would have become a story about what Hector did. If she'd gone to Rowan, it would have become a confrontation, a taking of sides, a thing that split the crew into camps before she'd had enough time to build anything solid. She'd seen that dynamic before, at her father's operation in Wyoming, and before that at the drying house outside Billings, where she'd worked 2 seasons in her early 20s. The moment a new person makes their problem into everyone else's problem, they stop being someone who can solve things and start being someone who needs to be managed. She was not going to be someone who needed to be managed. So she replaced the brine. She relabeled the canisters in her tight, careful handwriting. She adjusted the schedule by 1 day to account for the loss and tacked the new version to the inside of the smokehouse door. Same position as before, same format, same handwriting. She did not look at the door to see if anyone would pull it down again. She turned her back on it and went to work. Dale arrived at 7:30 with the expression of a man who had heard things and was not sure what to do with them. He stood in the doorway of the smokehouse for a moment before coming in, looking at the work table, at the canisters on the shelf, at the new schedule on the door. "You replaced it," he said. "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. "All of it?" "Enough to stay on schedule." He scratched the back of his neck. "Hector's going to—" "I don't care what Hector's going to do," she said. "Not with heat. Just as a fact, the way you state the weather." "Are you here to work?" He looked at her for a long moment with something she couldn't quite read on his face. Then he pulled his work gloves out of his back pocket and said, "What do you need?" That was the second small thing. She put him on the salting table. She showed him how she wanted it done, the layering, the coverage, the attention to the thick parts of the cut where the salt needed extra time to penetrate. He watched carefully, and he didn't ask why the way he had that first afternoon. He just did it. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The morning passed in near silence. Outside she could hear the normal sounds of the ranch, boots on frozen ground, the low complaint of cattle being moved, Pete's voice somewhere across the yard saying something with a laugh in it that didn't sound kind. She let the sounds wash past her and kept her focus on the work. Around mid-morning, Rowan appeared in the doorway. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the canisters. He looked at the schedule on the door. His jaw moved in a way that suggested he was working on something he wanted to say. "Elena," he said. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, which was true. "I know. I just wanted to—" "Mr. Mercer." She set down the piece she was working on and turned to look at him directly, because this needed to be direct. "What happened yesterday is done. I handled it. What I need from you right now is the replacement hooks for the east rack, which were supposed to be here 4 days ago, and I need to know if the next pork delivery is still scheduled for Friday." He blinked. "Friday? Yes." "Good, but the hooks? I'll check on them today." "Thank you," she said, and turned back to the table. He stood there for another few seconds. She could feel it. And then he left. She heard his boots on the hard ground going back toward the main house, and she let out a slow breath and pressed both hands flat on the work table and stared at the wood grain for about 5 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. Then she picked up the next piece and kept going. Dale watched all of this. He didn't comment, but something in his posture had shifted, and she would think about that later. The way a person's body changes when they start to recalibrate their expectations of you. The hooks arrived on Wednesday. Rowan brought them himself, which was not the kind of thing the ranch owner typically did, and Elena noted that without making anything of it. She was replacing the compromised ones on the east rack when Pete wandered in. He was the young one, early 30s, with the particular restless energy of someone who hasn't yet figured out what kind of man he wants to be and covers that uncertainty with noise. He looked at what she was doing. "You know there's a specific way those go in," he said. "I do," she said. "Because Hector always said, Pete." She didn't stop working. "How long has this rack been loose?" He thought about it. "Maybe 2 years, since before I got here." "So Hector's way didn't work," she said. Pete opened his mouth, closed it. She could almost see the thought process, the impulse to defend Hector, the recognition that she'd made a fair point, the discomfort of having both things be true at the same time. "I'm just saying," he said more quietly. "I know what you're saying," Elena said. She tightened the last hook and gave the rack a firm push to test it. Solid, better than solid. "Hand me that cloth?" He handed it to her without thinking. Then he seemed to realize he'd done it and looked slightly annoyed at himself, which she found almost funny. "You can go," she said. "I've got it from here." He went. She leaned against the rack and looked at the east wall. All hooks replaced, rack level, strong enough now to hold a real load. And she thought about how much of this work was not the salt or the wood or the fire. How much of it was this? The constant careful navigation of other people's insecurity, the management of egos that had nothing to do with smoking meat, and everything to do with who got to feel important in this particular square footage. Her father had been good at that. She was getting better. She was not, she knew, entirely good at it yet. There were moments, more than she liked, when she felt the anger rise in her like a pressure behind her sternum, when someone dismissed her work or questioned her judgment, and she had to make the conscious choice not to say the sharp, true thing that was sitting right there on her tongue. She'd learned that sharp, true things said in anger cost more than they gained, even when they were right, especially when they were right. But the effort of holding them back had a cost too. It lived somewhere behind her eyes by the end of a long day. She was aware of it. She locked the smokehouse for the night and walked back to the barn in the dark and sat on the edge of her bunk and ate the cold biscuit she'd saved from breakfast because she'd missed dinner again. And she thought about her father's hands, the way they'd looked at the end of a working day, red and strong and mapped with the small cuts and stains of the work. And she felt something that was not quite loneliness and not quite grief. Just a want. A wish that she could show him this smokehouse, show him the schedule on the wall and the full brine canisters on the shelf, hear him say the thing he used to say when a job was going right. Steady work, Ellie. Steady work. She finished the biscuit. She went to sleep. The Friday delivery came in heavier than expected. 2 extra carcasses Rowan had managed to negotiate at a better price from a ranch 20 miles north that had hit a rough patch. He told her about it with something cautious in his voice, like he was expecting her to be upset about the change in volume. She looked at the additional weight and ran the calculation in her head and said, I need 2 more days in the brine schedule and another 50 pounds of salt. I can get the salt, he said. Then it's fine. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the smokehouse that first evening. That particular look she was starting to recognize, like he was trying to reconcile what he'd expected with what he was actually seeing. You're not upset, he said. Why would I be upset? More volume is better. That's the whole point. Most people don't. He stopped himself. Most people what? She said. He shook his head. Nothing. I'll get the salt. She watched him walk toward the house and thought about what he'd started to say. Most people don't adapt like that. Most people need things to go the way they planned. She didn't know if he'd meant it as a compliment or if he just hadn't expected her to be practical. Either way, it stuck with her because it said something about what Rowan Mercer was used to. People who needed tending, people who brought their problems to him, people who required management. She was not going to be a person who required management. She decided that somewhere around age 12. The extra carcasses went into brine by Saturday evening. She stayed 3 hours past dark to get them in properly, working alone after Dale went home for supper. And when she finally locked the smokehouse and walked back through the yard, she found Rowan sitting on the porch steps with 2 cups of something hot. He held one out. She stopped. She looked at the cup, then at him. It's just coffee, he said. She sat down on the step below him and took the cup. It was good coffee, stronger than she'd expected. They didn't talk for a while. The mountain was dark against the sky, and the air had that particular bite in it that said the season was making up its mind about something, deciding whether to hold or let go. How much longer? He said eventually. Until the smokehouse is fully operational and the first stores are put up? Another week, week and a half, depending on the weather. And after that? She turned the cup in her hands. After that, it runs itself mostly. I monitor the temperature, check the cure at intervals, add salt where it's needed. The bulk of the hard work is the setup. And you? He said. She looked at him. Where do you go after? He said. You said your father's operation is gone. You don't have somewhere you're heading back to? She was quiet for a moment. This was the edge of a territory she was careful about. Not because the answer was painful, though it was, some, but because she'd learned that letting people know you didn't have anywhere else to go changed how they treated you, made them comfortable in a way that was not always comfortable for you. I'll find the next place, she said. You do this a lot? Move from ranch to ranch? When there's work, he nodded slowly. You're good enough to stay somewhere. I know that, she said simply. Not arrogant, just accurate. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he looked back at the mountain. Margaret, my wife. She left 3 years ago, he said. He said it the way men say things they don't usually say, without warm-up, like if they don't just push it out, it won't come out at all. She said the ranch swallowed everything. There wasn't anything left over. Elena didn't say anything. She'd learned that silence after something like that was usually the right answer. She wasn't wrong, he said. What happened to the smokehouse? She said. After she left. He looked at her sideways, surprised by the turn. I just mean, it was running before? She kept it, he said. I didn't know that until she was gone. I thought it was the hands, but it was her mostly. She had her own system. I didn't pay enough attention to know what her system was. He paused. By the time I figured that out, it was already 3 seasons behind. Elena looked at the cup in her hands. There was something in what he'd just said that was bigger than the smokehouse, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to say so directly. But it sat there between them on the porch step like a thing that had been acknowledged, and that was enough. She taught herself? Elena asked. Her mother, I think. Or someone before that. I don't know. He shook his head. I never asked. Elena thought about her father, about all the things he'd taught her that she'd asked for, and all the things she'd learned just by watching, and all the things that had still surprised her, even after 31 years, even in the last months when she'd been with him every day. How much a person could hold that nobody thought to ask them about. You should ask, she said, when you have the chance. It matters. He didn't answer, but she thought he heard it. She finished her coffee and handed the cup back and said goodnight, and went inside, and she lay in the dark for a while thinking about the conversation with the specific alertness of someone who understands that things have shifted and is still deciding what that means. The first ham came out of the smokehouse on a Tuesday, 3 days before she'd expected it. She'd pushed the process, not recklessly, but with the confidence of knowing exactly when the cure had done its work, reading the signs she'd been reading her whole life. The color was right. The texture was right. The smell was right in a way that was almost architectural, structured and deep, and nothing like the flat smell of unseasoned meat, nothing like the rancid smell of something that had gone wrong. It smelled like winter stores done correctly for the first time in 5 years. She carried it to the main house herself. She set it on the kitchen table and Rowan stood there looking at it and she said, "Cut into it." He cut into it. She watched his face. It took him a moment. He pressed his fingers against the interior the way she'd shown him in the smokehouse that evening, feeling for the texture, the evenness of the cure, and she could see the moment when he felt what she'd been trying to describe. Something settled in his expression, something that had been tight for a long time went a little less tight. That's right, he said. Yes, she said. He looked up at her. How did you know it was ready early? I checked it at midnight, she said, and again at 4. It was there. He stared at her. You went out at 4 in the morning to check a ham. I went out at 4 in the morning to check the ham, she said. Singular. The others aren't ready yet. He was quiet for a moment with something complicated happening in his face, and then he laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, genuine, slightly helpless sound like something had broken through a wall he'd been maintaining for a while. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. She hadn't expected it to change his face as much as it did. I'm going to have the crew taste it, she said, if that's all right with you. He was still smiling slightly. Why? Because, she said, and she chose her next words carefully. They've been working against what they don't believe in. If they can taste what this is, they'll start working towards something they do. He looked at her. That's smart. It's practical, she said. She took the ham and she sliced it, and she brought it to the crew at the midday meal, set it on the table in the middle of everything else without announcement, without ceremony, without even particularly drawing attention to it. She just put it there and stood back. Pete took a piece first because Pete always took food first. He chewed it. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "That's good," in the specific tone of someone who hadn't expected to say that. Cal took a piece. Jerome. Dale, who already knew it would be good, but tasted it with the honest appreciation of someone who hadn't had properly cured pork in years. Hector sat at the far end of the table and did not take a piece. Nobody commented on that. But Elena noticed that when Hector looked down at the table, he was looking at what was on it, and his jaw was tight, and he wasn't talking the way he usually talked, with that low, constant commentary that kept everyone oriented toward him. He was quiet, and his quiet was a different quality than her quiet. Where hers was a place to work from, his was a place to hide what was happening behind his eyes. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away. The afternoon went better than any afternoon since she'd arrived. Dale showed her, without being asked, where the additional salt stores were kept from 3 seasons back, a cache she hadn't known about, sealed well enough to still be good. Pete stopped lounging in the smokehouse doorway, making commentary, and started actually handing her things when she needed them, which more than doubled her efficiency. Cal and Jerome, the two who'd mostly just followed the group's temperature, were now following a different temperature and didn't seem to mind. Hector stayed away from the smokehouse entirely. She knew that wasn't finished. She knew the specific silence of a man who had made a decision but hadn't found his moment yet. Her father had described that kind once. The ones who come back quiet are more trouble than the ones who stay loud. She was watching for it. But for that afternoon, in the particular slant of October light that made everything look a little more bearable, the smokehouse was warm and the work was going right, and she let herself feel that without qualification. Oh, it was Dale who told her without quite meaning to about the debts. He said it obliquely, the way people in small communities talk about things they're not supposed to know. In the middle of a conversation about the East Pasture fence and whether it would hold through a hard winter. He said something like, Mercer can't afford another bad year, and then he went quiet and his eyes went sideways in that way that says, I've said more than I meant to. Elena kept her face neutral. Has it been a bad few years? 4 bad ones in a row, Dale said, quietly, like he was already regretting starting. Lost a good portion of the herd to that ice storm 3 winters back. Before that, the feed prices went through the roof. And then Margaret going, not that that was money, but things fell apart in a particular way after that. Things he'd been keeping together started coming apart. The smokehouse, she said, among other things. She thought about this later, back in the smokehouse alone with the evening fire. She thought about Rowan handing her that key at the fence post without much negotiation, without asking the right questions, without even demanding to see proof of what she claimed she could do. She thought it was fatigue, or desperation, or bad judgment. Now she was rethinking. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was a man who had stopped trusting his own judgment and was making decisions from a place that no longer felt like solid ground. She understood that. Not from ranching, but from the years after her father died, when she'd had to figure out how to be in the world without the person who'd taught her everything she knew about it. There had been a period, she didn't like to think about it too much, when she'd made decisions the same way, fast and without enough consideration. From desperation that she'd dressed up as confidence. She'd gotten better, she'd had to. She stood up and checked the temperature gauge she'd rigged on the chimney. A simple system, a strip of heat-sensitive paper at 2 points in the flue, and made her notes and banked the fire for the night, and was reaching for her coat when she heard footsteps outside. Not Rowan's footsteps. She knew his by now. Longer stride, slight drag on the left heel from an old injury he'd never mentioned, but that she'd noticed because she noticed things. These were different. She didn't move toward the door. The footsteps stopped outside. I know you're in there, Hector said. She put on her coat. She picked up her record book. She opened the door. He was standing about 4 feet back from the entrance, arms not crossed this time, hands loose at his sides, which was somehow worse. Crossed arms were defensive. Hands loose like that meant a man had already worked through his own argument and arrived somewhere settled. Hector, she said. I want you to understand something, he said. Not loud. Not with the performance of that morning 2 weeks ago when he dumped the brine in front of an audience. This was a private conversation, and he'd chosen it deliberately, which told her something important about what kind of man he actually was. The public version was about dominance. This version was about something else. I've been on this ranch 9 years, he said. I've kept it running through things you don't know about. I've had Rowan's back when nobody else did. I believe you, she said. He stopped. He'd been ready for something else. I'm not here to take your place, she said. I'm not trying to be what you are on this ranch. What I'm doing is in that building. She tilted her head toward the smokehouse. It doesn't have anything to do with your position. It has everything to do with my position, he said. When a stranger comes in and the boss hands over authority like it's nothing, it says something about what he thinks of the people who are already here. She looked at him for a moment. Or it says he was desperate and made a practical decision. That doesn't mean what you've built here doesn't matter. He studied her face. She kept it even. You're smooth, he said. I'll give you that. I'm tired, she said honestly. I'm not smooth. I'm just trying to get through a very large amount of work in a very short amount of time, and I'd rather do that without fighting you, but I'll do it either way. Something shifted in his face, just slightly. The settled quality she'd read as resolved hardened slightly, and then something in it gave. Just a fraction. The way ice on a river looks solid until you get close enough to see it moving. "The brine canisters," he said. "Done," she said. "Replaced. We're on schedule." He looked at her for another long moment. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to, and she didn't need him to. What she needed was for him to stop actively sabotaging her, and she could see in his face that the calculation was happening. The same calculation she'd watched in Dale's face, in Pete's, in every face that had been set against her and then had to contend with the reality of what she was actually producing. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. She stood in the cold for a moment and let her breath out and watched the vapor of it disappear. Not a resolution, not a friendship, but a door that had been closed had opened, slightly, and that was enough to work with. She went inside and wrote her notes for the day by lantern light, and when she got to the section of her record book where she tracked the status of the operation, she wrote 2 words in the margin that had nothing to do with salt or fire or cure times. Turning point. She wasn't sure she was right. She wasn't sure she wasn't. She closed the book. She banked the fire. She went to bed. Outside, the first real cold of the season had settled in from the north, the kind of cold that meant business, the kind that said winter was not waiting for anyone's schedule or anyone's readiness. The smokehouse held its warmth against it. The stores on the shelves were growing, not fast enough yet, not full, but growing. And the work was real, and it was right, and it was hers. For tonight, that was enough. The turning point Elena had written in the margin of her record book turned out to be real, but it didn't look the way she'd imagined it. She'd expected Hector to stay out of her way. He did, mostly. She'd expected Dale to keep showing up and keep working and keep being the steady, unglamorous help that he was. He did that too. She'd expected Pete to gradually stop being annoying and start being useful, which happened in the slow, uneven way that young men become useful. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, occasional regression into idiocy followed by genuine effort. What she hadn't expected was the town. Rowan drove into Callow Creek on a Friday to settle accounts at the feed store, which was the kind of errand he'd been putting off because settling accounts when you owe more than you've paid is an exercise in controlled humiliation. He did it anyway because the alternative was worse. He came back that afternoon with a set to his jaw that Elena recognized, the specific tightness of someone who had absorbed something and hadn't finished processing it. She was at the smokehouse door when he rode in. She watched him dismount and hand the horse off without his usual word to the animal. He always said something to the horse, she'd noticed, some small acknowledgement, and she knew before he said anything that something had happened in town. She waited until after supper. He came to the smokehouse at dusk the way he'd started doing most evenings, not always with coffee, sometimes just standing in the doorway for a few minutes like the warmth of the fire was what he'd come for. "What happened in Callow Creek?" she said. He leaned against the doorframe. "Gideon Walsh." She didn't know the name. "Who is he?" "Runs the Walsh operation about 12 miles east, big spread, 3rd generation." He paused. "He was at the feed store when I came in. Him and 2 of his men." She waited. "He made a comment," Rowan said, "about the ranch, about me hiring—" He stopped, started again. "About the situation here." "About me," she said. "About my judgment," he said, and the way he said it told her he was choosing that framing deliberately, protecting something with it. He said a man who'd let his smokehouse rot for 5 years and then handed it to a drifter girl had no business calling himself a cattleman. Elena set down the tool she was holding. "What did you say?" "Not enough," he said. She looked at him. He was staring at a point somewhere past the east rack, jaw working. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means I said the work was going well, and that I stood behind my hire," he said. And he laughed. Him and his men. And the feed store owner, Pruitt, who I've known 15 years, he didn't say a word, just kept his head down. He pushed off the doorframe and came inside, further than he usually did, and stood with his hands in his coat pockets. There were 4 other people in that store. She understood. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the audience, the witnesses, the public quality of it. "Did anyone say anything in your defense?" she said. "No," he said, and then after a beat, "That's not what bothers me most." She waited again. What bothers me most, he said, is that 6 weeks ago, I might have agreed with him. The smokehouse was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest, carrying the first real bite of what was coming. The fire in the chimney responded to it, a low pull, a deeper draw, and the light in the room shifted slightly. And now? She said. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. Now, I think Gideon Walsh hasn't seen the inside of his own smokehouse in 20 years because he has people who do it for him, and he wouldn't know what right-cured pork feels like if you put it in his hand. Elena picked up her tool. That's probably true, she said. I should have said something more, he said. In the store. Yes, she said. You should have. He looked slightly startled. He'd been expecting something softer, maybe. Reassurance, or the gentle redirect that people offered when they wanted to ease a man's guilt without requiring him to sit in it. She wasn't going to do that. But you know what you should have said now, she continued, which means you'll know what to say the next time it happens. You think it'll happen again. People like Gideon Walsh don't say something once, she said. They say it until there's a reason to stop. He was quiet. Then, what would give him a reason to stop? She looked at the shelves, the hams hanging in the smoking chamber, the rows of brine canisters, all labeled, all full. The schedule on the wall tracking 37 days of work that had taken her working before dawn and past dark, and through a night she didn't like to think about yet to produce. Full shelves by the first hard snow, she said. That'll give him a reason. She found out about the rest of the town's opinion gradually, the way you find out about a wound. Not all at once, but in the small, consistent evidence of it. The feed store delivery came short by 40 pounds that week, and when she sent Dale to collect the remainder, he came back with the flour, but not the salt. And his explanation was hedged in a way that meant someone hadn't wanted to fill the order completely. The blacksmith who was supposed to send over a replacement chimney bracket delayed 3 times with reasons that didn't quite hold together. A woman named Frances Pruitt, the feed store owner's wife, stopped Elena on the main road when she drove the wagon in for supplies and said, with the specific kindness of someone delivering bad news in a friendly register, that people in town were talking and that Elena might want to know what they were saying. They're saying you've taken advantage of a man in a bad situation, Frances said. She had the decency to look uncomfortable. That you came in and made yourself indispensable, and that Rowan doesn't have the sense to see it. Taken advantage how? Elena said. That you're running things that aren't yours to run. That a young woman alone on a ranch with no connections and no references and no... She stopped. People make assumptions. I know what assumptions they make, Elena said. Her voice came out even. It cost her something to keep it that way. Is there anything else? Gideon Walsh has been talking to people on the eastern ranches, Frances said, and now her voice dropped slightly, genuinely uncomfortable. About whether Mercer can be trusted to manage a proper operation. He's been suggesting that the spring cattle contracts might go elsewhere. Elena sat with that for a moment. The cattle contracts. That was the income that kept a ranch viable between seasons, the thing you could not afford to lose. Thank you, she said to Frances. I mean that. She drove back to the ranch and she did not tell Rowan what Frances had said. Not yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to think about it first. Needed to turn it over and look at it from the right angle before she brought it to him. Rowan was a man who responded to problems by taking them personally, and a problem taken personally stopped being something you could solve and started being something you had to survive. She needed him solving, not surviving. She added an hour to her workday. The first sign that the weather was changing its mind about the schedule came on a Monday night when the temperature dropped 12 degrees in 4 hours. Elena woke up at 2 in the morning, not because of an alarm. She had no alarm. But because something in the quality of the air had changed and her body registered it before her mind did. She lay in the dark for 2 seconds, and then she was up and dressed and moving. Outside, the cold had gone predatory. It wasn't the sharp, clean cold of a normal autumn night. It was the pressing, deliberate cold of a system moving in, the kind that had intention behind it. The sky was the wrong color for 2 in the morning, too bright at the edges, a dirty pale, snow light reflecting off cloud cover that had come in fast from the north. She ran the numbers in her head as she crossed the yard. The smokehouse fire needed to be maintained at a specific temperature range for the curing process to work and for the finished stores not to freeze. A fine balance between too cold and too hot, and a hard frost arriving 4 to 5 weeks ahead of schedule could destroy everything that wasn't already fully processed if the fire went out or if the temperature fluctuated too fast. She had approximately 40% of the stores still in process. She pushed open the smokehouse door. The fire was low. Not out, but low. The banked coals she'd left at 11 were still alive, but barely, and the temperature inside had already dropped 6 degrees from where it needed to be. She could see it on the strip gauge at the chimney. She didn't panic. Panic was what you did when you hadn't been trained for something. She'd been trained for this. She built the fire back up carefully. Not fast, because fast meant uneven, and uneven meant temperature spikes that could damage the outer layer of a cure mid-process. She added wood in stages, watching the gauge, adjusting the damper, coaxing the temperature back up the way you'd bring a sick animal back. Slowly, steadily, without startling it. It took 40 minutes to get it right. Then she sat down on the wooden stool beside the fire, and she watched it. She had not brought her coat. She'd been moving fast enough in the first minutes that she hadn't felt the cold. But now that she was sitting still, she felt it. The draft from the north-facing wall, the chill that lived in the floor of the building, no matter how warm the fire ran. She pulled her knees up and pressed her hands between her thighs and watched the gauge and fed the fire, and did not go back for the coat because going back meant leaving the fire, and she was not going to leave the fire. An hour passed. The stores on the upper shelves were fine. The ones in the middle were recovering. The brine canisters, the ones still processing, were the concern. She got up every 20 minutes to check them, pressing her fingers into the surface of each piece the way she'd shown Rowan, reading what she felt with a concentration so focused that the cold stopped being something she was aware of and became just a fact, like the floor under her feet or the smoke above her head. 2 in the morning became 3. 3 became 4. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, and then, eventually, the first sound of snow. Not the soft hiss of light flakes, but the ticking, granular sound of sleet mixed in, which meant the storm was serious and moving fast. She fed the fire. Around 4:30, she heard boots on the frozen ground outside. The door opened, and Rowan stood there in his coat and his boots, and his expression of a man who had woken up and looked out his window and seen the light in the smokehouse still burning and had made a decision about what that meant. He looked at her. He looked at the fire. He looked at the gauge. "How long have you been in here?" he said. "Since 2, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He came inside and closed the door behind him. He looked at the shelves. "What's the situation?" he said. "Temperature drop came in fast," she said. "If I hadn't caught it at 2, we'd have lost the middle rack, maybe more. As it is, we're fine. 30 more minutes and I'll know for certain." He pulled a second stool from the corner, a small 3-legged thing she'd never seen him use, and set it near the fire. "Then I'll wait the 30 minutes with you," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't asking, he wasn't offering, he was just stating a fact, the same way she stated facts, as information, not sentiment. She looked back at the fire. "All right," she said. They sat there without talking. The sleet hit the roof. The fire breathed. She got up twice to check the stores, and he watched her do it and said nothing, just watched the way she moved through the routine of it, the unhurried precision of hands that knew their work. At the end of 30 minutes, she pressed her fingers into the last 2 pieces on the middle rack and held them there and felt what she needed to feel. "We're good," she said. He let out a breath, just one, slow, controlled. But she heard it. "Every piece," he said. "Every piece." He stood up. He looked at the shelves for a long moment. All of it, the hams and the bellies and the shoulder cuts, the brine canisters in their rows, the careful labels, the months of her father's knowledge and her own 15 years working it into the bones of this particular building on this particular mountain in this particular terrible autumn. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. He seemed to be working on the right words and not finding them, which was not unusual for him. He was a man who understood things before he could say them, which sometimes meant things went unsaid too long. "I know," she said. He nodded. He picked up the stool and put it back in the corner. "I'll get coffee," he said. "Don't argue with me about it." She almost smiled. "I wasn't going to." He left. She stood alone in the smokehouse in the growing warmth of the rebuilt fire, and let herself feel the exhaustion that she'd been holding at bay for the last 3 hours. The real weight of it, the particular tiredness that lives in your hands and your eyes after sustained concentration. She pressed her palms flat against the work table and leaned on it and breathed. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls of the building and found no way in. Rowan came back with coffee and something else he hadn't mentioned. He'd woken Dale, who arrived 10 minutes later with his work gloves and the specific expression of a man who understood the situation without needing it, explained. Dale took over the fire watch at 5 so Elena could sit down properly, and she sat on the stool by the wall and drank her coffee and watched the light in the chimney strip and didn't fight the exhaustion anymore. She was asleep by 5:30, still on the stool, her back against the wall and her chin dropped toward her chest. She didn't know she'd fallen asleep. One moment she was there, watching the fire, and then she wasn't anywhere, and then it was light, full light, gray-white light coming under the smokehouse door. She opened her eyes. Dale was at the fire. Rowan was on the other stool, awake, holding an empty coffee cup, watching her in the way that people watch someone sleep when they think they won't be caught. He looked away when her eyes opened. "What time is it?" she said. "Nearly 8, Dale said without turning around. She sat up straight and pressed her palms to her face for a moment, and then she got up and went to the middle rack and checked the stores. She went through every piece on every shelf, methodical, thorough, the same routine as always, not faster because she'd slept and not slower because she was still tired. All of it was right. She turned around. Dale and Rowan were both watching her. "We didn't lose anything," she said. Dale made a sound that was not quite a word, somewhere between relief and satisfaction. He sat down heavily on an overturned crate and pressed both hands on his knees and looked at the floor. Rowan looked at the shelves. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Elena. "I owe you more than I can say right now," he said. She shook her head. "You owe me the rest of the salt delivery and that bracket from the blacksmith." He almost laughed. "Not quite. I'll get them today." "Good." She picked up her record book and opened it. "The storm's going to last another day, maybe 2. When it clears, I want to do a full assessment of what's fully processed and what still needs time. We might be in better shape than I thought." "How much better?" She ran her eye down the records. "If the last batch finishes clean, we could be looking at 70, maybe 75% of a full winter store." She paused. "For a ranch this size, in a normal winter, that's enough." "And if it's not a normal winter?" She looked at him. "Then we stretch it. And we're smarter about it than you've been before." He accepted that without flinching, which she noted. 2 weeks ago, he'd have looked uncomfortable. Something had shifted. "I need to eat something," she said, "and then I'm coming back." She walked to the main house in the storm. The sleet had turned to proper snow, fat and dense, already laying down a real cover. And she stood in the kitchen and ate cold biscuits and leftover coffee from the morning's pot, and looked out the window at the yard, at the smokehouse with the faint line of smoke still rising from its chimney, and thought about her father. He'd done something like this once. Not the same. His smokehouse in Wyoming had been hit by a wind that damaged the chimney cap in the middle of a night cure, and he'd spent 6 hours in 30-degree weather making emergency repairs with materials he improvised from what was in the barn. She'd been 11. She'd been asleep. She'd woken up to find the problem already solved, and her father at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and his eyes with the specific quality of someone who has been thoroughly used up and is refilling slowly. She'd asked him if he was okay. He'd looked at her and said, "The work got done, Ellie. That's what okay means out here." She stood at the kitchen window with her cold biscuit and thought about that definition of okay. It wasn't the definition most people used. Most people meant something about feelings when they said okay, something about internal state, about comfort or peace. Her father had meant something different. He'd meant the thing that needed to happen, happened. The thing that needed to be saved was saved. By that definition, she was very okay this morning. She went back out into the snow. She found out about the Walsh situation from Rowan himself, finally, 3 days after the storm cleared. He told her in the way he told her most things, without preamble, standing in the doorway, like the doorway was a position that gave him something to lean on if the conversation went badly. "Walsh has been talking to the Eastern ranches," he said, "about the spring contracts." She looked up from the work table. "I heard something about that." He looked at her. "From who?" "Francis Pruitt, on the road a couple weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." I was thinking about how to tell you, she said honestly. I didn't want you to take it personally before you could think about it practically. He was quiet again, longer this time. She could see the thing working in him, the irritation at being managed, the recognition that she'd had a reason, the conflict between those two things. I can handle difficult information, he said. I know you can, she said. I wasn't sure you could handle it at the right time. There's a difference. He didn't argue, which meant she wasn't entirely wrong. Walsh is coming to the area next week, he said. He's organizing something. Informal meeting of the Eastern ranchers, under the guise of talking about spring planning. What he's actually doing is making his case against Mercer Ranch before the contracts go out. She set down her pen. And you're going? I'm going, he said. Good. She thought for a moment. Take the records. He looked at her. What records? Mine. She picked up the record book from the table, the one she'd been keeping since the first day, every ratio, every temperature reading, every note on timing and adjustment, and the results of each decision. Take this and the two that came before it, and take a ham. A ham. The first one. The one that came out early. She hadn't cut into it beyond the initial taste test. She'd kept it whole, wrapped and stored, waiting without quite knowing what she was waiting for. Now she knew. Let them handle it. Let Walsh's people handle it. Let them smell it and feel the texture and taste it if they want. Numbers on a page tell you something. Your hands tell you something else. He looked at the record book in her outstretched hand. You'd trust me with that? He said. It's your ranch, she said. It's your winter. Why wouldn't I? He took the book. He stood there holding it for a moment like he was recalibrating something, some expectation or assumption that the weight of it in his hands was requiring him to revise. Walsh is going to ask who wrote this, he said. Tell him, she said. He'll use it against you. Against me. He'll say a woman's records aren't. Tell him anyway, she said. And when he says that, you show him the ham. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. My father had a competitor once, she said. Man named Trescott, over in Laramie. Went around to every buyer in the county telling them my father's operation was substandard, that he didn't have the experience, that they were taking a risk. She paused. My father invited Trescott to come and taste the product. Did he come? He sent a representative, she said, which was Trescott being careful. The representative came, he ate, he went back and told Trescott what he'd eaten. She picked up her pen again. Trescott stopped talking. Rowan was quiet for a moment. That simple? It's never simple, she said. But the product doesn't lie. That's the advantage. Everything else, the talking, the politics, the who said what, all of that can be twisted. What you taste is what it is. He looked down at the record book in his hands. He looked at it the way she'd seen him look at the fence post he'd been fighting that first morning, like something he'd been wrestling with that had finally stopped resisting. I'll go Thursday, he said. Good, she said. Wear something that doesn't make you look like you've been losing. He blinked. Then something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. That's specific advice. It's practical advice, she said. People read what they see before they read what you say. You know that. He left with the record book and she went back to work. And the smokehouse was warm and the stores were good. And outside the snow was deep and clean across the ranch. And she thought about Thursday, and thought about Walsh, and thought about what Rowan would walk into, and she felt something she didn't entirely want to feel, something adjacent to worry, which was a problem because you couldn't worry about someone you were only professionally connected to without it meaning something about the nature of the connection. She pushed it aside and kept working. Thursday came and Rowan rode out early. He'd packed the ham himself the night before, and she'd seen the light in the kitchen, and he'd taken the record books without her having to remind him. He didn't tell her where the meeting was, and she didn't ask. What she did was go to work, same as every day, and add nothing to the anxiety of waiting by thinking about it. He came back at dusk. She heard him ride in. She heard him unsaddle the horse and say something to it. The small word he always gave it, the acknowledgement she'd noticed from the first day. She heard his boots on the porch. She waited. He came to the smokehouse 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway. He looked different. Not triumphant. She would have been suspicious of triumphant. Something quieter and more solid. The look of a man who has stood in a difficult room and come out of it knowing something he didn't know going in. Walsh didn't expect the records, he said. No, she said. He said what I told you he'd say. About the source. He paused. I didn't argue with him. I put the ham on the table. She waited. His foreman cut into it, Rowan said. Walsh tried to wave it off, said it wasn't relevant. His foreman cut into it anyway. He stopped. Something in his face was very careful. 3 of the Eastern ranchers asked me how long the operation had been running. What did you tell them? 6 weeks, he said, including setup. She could see him working through what had happened in that room, sorting it into the right categories, deciding what it meant. 2 of them want to talk about the spring contracts directly, he said. Not through Walsh, directly with Mercer Ranch. She set down the tool she was holding. Walsh's foreman asked for your name, he said. He wrote it down. She thought about that. Gideon Walsh's foreman writing her name into his own record somewhere, carrying it back to an operation she'd never seen, where it would sit in someone's notebook as a fact about the world. I should have told you that a long time ago, Rowan said. She looked at him. Told me what? Your name, he said. The first day. I should have learned it properly instead of... He stopped. I called you the woman to Dale for 2 days before I stopped doing it. I didn't think about it until later. She was quiet for a moment. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. You know it now, she said. I do, he said. Elena Breyer. He said it like it was a complete sentence, which it was. She picked up her pen. She looked at the record book. She looked at the shelves, at the full rows, at the work that had been done, and the work still to do, and the winter settling in deep and cold and solid outside these walls. The 3rd batch finishes tomorrow, she said. If it comes out clean, we're at 80%. Is that enough? He said. It's more than enough, she said. It's more than this ranch has had in 5 years. He stood there for another moment. The fire worked behind the damper. The snow outside had stopped and the night had gone very quiet. The particular quiet of a cold that has settled in and means to stay. Thank you, he said, for staying in here that night, for the storm. It was the job, she said. It was more than the job, he said. She didn't argue. She let that stand because it was true. And because some truths didn't need managing, they just needed room. He said goodnight and walked back to the house, and she stayed another hour with the fire, and the smokehouse held its warmth against the January cold that had arrived 2 months early, and every shelf was full, and the records were right, and somewhere in Callow Creek a foreman had written her name in a notebook, and her father's work was alive in this building in the mountains of Montana, passed down through her hands into wood and salt and smoke, and it was real, and it was enough. And tonight that was more than she'd had when she arrived. The 3rd batch came out clean. Elena checked it at first light, before anyone else was awake, before the ranch had made any of its morning sounds. She went through every piece on every shelf with the same routine she'd used since the first day: fingers, pressure, texture, smell. And what she found was exactly what the records predicted she would find. Uniform cure. No soft spots. No salt failure on the thick cuts. Nothing that shouldn't be there and nothing missing that should. She stood in the middle of the smokehouse for a moment with her hands at her sides and just looked at it, all of it. The full shelves, the hanging chamber with its rows of finished hams, the brine station clean and organized, the records on the wall, tracking every decision she'd made from the first morning she'd unlocked this building until this morning. 80% of a full winter store. Finished. She wrote it in the record book. She wrote the date, the time, the temperature inside and outside. She wrote the final notes on each piece with the same care she'd given the first entries 6 weeks ago when there had been nothing on these shelves and the building had smelled like abandonment. Then she closed the book and went to make breakfast. She was not someone who made a production of accomplishment. Her father had taught her that the work was the point, not the recognition of the work, and she'd believed that for most of her life. But she was also honest enough to know that this particular morning felt different from other mornings, that something in her chest was lighter than it had been since she'd arrived at this gate with her travel bag, and that pretending otherwise would be a form of dishonesty she wasn't interested in. She made eggs. She made coffee. She set an extra place at the kitchen table because she'd been eating her meals mostly in the smokehouse or the barn room, and this morning she felt like sitting at an actual table with the specific intention of having earned it. Rowan came down the stairs at 6:30 and stopped when he saw her at the stove. 3rd batch? He said. He already knew from her face. Finished, she said. Clean. Every piece. He sat down at the table. He sat like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. Not collapsed, not relieved in a loud way, just settled. More of his weight on the chair than usual. 80%, he said. 82 if I'm being precise, she said. He looked at the table for a moment, then, Margaret never got past 60 in a good year. Elena set a plate in front of him. She didn't have the altitude ratios right, she said. It's a common mistake up here. The salt behaves differently above 4,000 feet, and most people don't account for it until they've lost a batch. He looked up. You knew that before you came? My father figured it out the hard way, she said. Billings, 1961, lost half a season's work. He spent 2 years after that working out exactly what the adjustment needed to be. She sat down across from him. I inherited the answer without having to earn it the hard way. That's what being taught properly means. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his fork and didn't use it. He sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. He was, she said simply. They ate without talking for a while, which was a different kind of quiet than the silence that had lived in this kitchen before she'd arrived. Not the silence of a house that had given up on having people in it, but the ordinary silence of two people sharing a meal who didn't need to fill the air between them with words. Rowan poured himself more coffee and said, The 2 Eastern ranchers, Halverson and Doyle. They want to meet with me before the month is out. I know, she said. He'd told her last week. Halverson's the one to focus on, Rowan said. Doyle goes where Halverson goes. They're not a package, but they're close to it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Halverson is careful. He'll want to see the operation himself, not just take my word. Then show him, she said. I want you there, he said. She looked at him. It's your meeting. It's your work, he said. I can tell him what you did. I can show him the records. But if he asks me to explain the altitude ratio adjustment, I'm going to stand there with my mouth open and look like a fool. He paused. I'd rather not look like a fool in front of Halverson. You could learn it, she said. I could, he said. I also don't have the time to learn it before the end of the month. She considered this. There was a version of the situation where she should say no, where being present at a business meeting between ranchers was a step beyond the scope of what she'd been hired to do, where it blurred lines that were already blurrier than she'd intended them to get. She was aware of that. She was also aware that the spring contracts, if Rowan got them, would mean another season, would mean the ranch stayed solvent, would mean the work she'd done this winter had a future to sustain rather than a single season to show for itself. I'll be there, she said. But you do the talking first. I'm there if he asks something you can't answer. That's fair, he said. She finished her coffee. She stood up and took her plate to the sink. Elena, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen on the porch that first evening, when he'd told her about Margaret, the expression of a man working up to something he hadn't said and wasn't sure how to say. I made an error in how I set this up, he said. When I hired you, I told you I needed someone to run the smokehouse, and I gave you the authority, and then I let the men ignore that authority for 2 weeks without doing anything about it. He said it steadily, without qualification. I should have handled Hector the first day. I knew what he was doing, and I didn't do anything. She was quiet. I told myself it wasn't my place to manage the conflict, he said. That you could handle it, which you could, you did. But that wasn't the right reasoning. The right reasoning was that I set up a situation and I had a responsibility to back it up, and I didn't. She leaned against the counter. Why are you telling me this now? Because I didn't tell you then, he said. And I've been thinking about it since the morning you replaced the brine and didn't say a word to me about it. He looked at his cup. You shouldn't have had to do that alone. It was a specific thing to say. She turned it over. No, she said. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him for a moment. An apology from a man like Rowan Mercer, not profuse, not performative, just direct and plainly meant, was not a small thing. She recognized it for what it was. Thank you, she said, for saying it. She went back to the smokehouse, and the morning was cold and clear, and the snow lay deep and unbroken across the yard, and she felt the apology settle into the record of this place alongside everything else. The spilled brine, and the night by the fire, and the foreman writing her name in a notebook, and she thought that the record of a thing was made up of more than the work itself. It was made up of what people did when the work got hard, what they said when they could have stayed quiet, what they stood behind when standing behind it cost them something. Hector came to the smokehouse that afternoon. She didn't turn around when she heard the door. She knew his footsteps now, heavier on the right than the left, a different pattern from Dale's rolling gait or Pete's quick shuffle. She kept working. "Batch finished," he said. It wasn't a question. "This morning," she said. He came in further than he usually had since the night of their conversation outside, which meant he'd mostly stayed away, and she'd let him, because proximity was not what mattered. What mattered was whether he'd try to undo things again, and he hadn't. Dale said 80-something%. 82, she said. He was quiet. She could hear him looking at the shelves without seeing him look. "How long have we gone without hitting 80? He said. "You'd know better than I would," she said. 5 years, he said. "Maybe 6. Before Margaret got sick." A pause. "You didn't know that." "About Margaret." "That she was sick?" "She kept the smokehouse going while she was sick," he said. "That last year. Kept it running on less than she had, because she knew what would happen to this place if it went under." Another pause, heavier. "I knew, and I didn't pick up what she dropped. I don't know what I thought, that someone else would figure it out." Elena set down her work and turned around. This was not the Hector she'd been managing for 6 weeks. This was something under that, older and less guarded and not comfortable about being visible. "You feel responsible," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who doesn't like being read accurately. "I feel like I should have done more," he said. "That's different." "Is it?" He didn't answer that. "Hector." She kept her voice even. "What happened with the brine in the beginning? I understand why you did it. I don't agree with it, but I understand what it was about." He looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "You'd been holding this place together in your own way for years," she said. "And someone came in and was handed authority over something you'd been watching fail because nobody gave you authority over it. That's a real thing to be angry about." He was very quiet. "If Rowan had asked you to run the smokehouse," she said, "would you have known how?" The quiet stretched out. "No," he said finally. "Not the way you do." "Then the problem wasn't that I was here," she said. "The problem was how it was communicated. That's on Rowan." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "People keep saying that," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly. Hector wasn't a warm man, but something that was the absence of opposition. The dropping of a stance that had been costing both of them. "The East Pasture needs work come spring," he said, which was such a non sequitur that she almost missed what it was. An offering. A topic change that was actually a peace gesture dressed up as information. "Tell Rowan," she said. "He'll want a plan for it." "I know he will," Hector said. He pulled on his gloves. "Good work," he said, and it came out rough, like a word he'd practiced and still hadn't gotten comfortable with. He left before she could respond. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned back to the work table and picked up where she'd left off, and the afternoon light through the high window was pale and clean, and the smokehouse smelled the way it was supposed to smell, rich and deep and finished, and she thought that some things you didn't get to resolve cleanly, some things you just got to move past, which was a different category, but sometimes it was enough. Pete came to her 2 days later with a question. This was notable because Pete had never come to her with a question. He'd come with commentary disguised as questions, with assistance rendered with enough reluctance to make it feel like a personal sacrifice. An actual question, genuine, asked without visible resentment, was new. "The temperature strip on the chimney," he said. "Is that something you made, or is that a real thing?" "I made it," she said. "It's heat-sensitive paper. My father rigged something similar with a different material, but this works at altitude." Pete looked at it. "Can I see how it works?" She showed him. She explained the 2 measurement points and what the difference between them told her about the draft, about whether the fire was drawing correctly, about early warning signs of blockage. He listened in the specific way of someone who is actually interested, head slightly forward, no performance. "That's useful," he said. "It is," she said. He stood there for another moment. I want to learn more of this, he said. And then, before she could respond, something crossed his face. Embarrassment or self-consciousness or the discomfort of having said a true thing. And he said quickly, I mean, it seems like something worth knowing for the ranch. It is something worth knowing, she said. She handed him the current day's record page. Start with this. Tell me what you think it says. He looked at it. He worked through it slowly. The temperature readings, the timing notations, the adjustment she'd made to the damper at 2 in the afternoon when the draft had changed. He got most of it right. He missed one thing, a small one, and when she pointed it out, he nodded immediately without arguing, which was the most encouraging thing she'd seen from him. Tomorrow morning, she said, you can do the 6 a.m. check. I'll be here. You read the strip and tell me what you see, and I'll tell you if you're right. He looked up from the paper. He was trying not to look pleased and not entirely succeeding. Okay, he said. Don't be late, she said. The 6 o'clock reading means 6 o'clock. He was there at 5:50. She watched him read the strip. He was careful. He was slower than she would be, but careful was more important than fast at this stage. He told her what he saw. He was right on all 3 points. She said, good, and nothing else. And he went to his morning work without making anything of it, and she thought about how much of teaching was simply being present for the moment when someone was ready to learn, not pushing before that moment, not waiting too long past it. Her father had been extraordinary at that. She was still figuring out when she was good at it and when she wasn't. Dale, watching this exchange from across the yard, said nothing to anyone about it. But that evening she heard him talking to Cal and Jerome about the altitude ratio, explaining it with the confidence of someone who had learned it and was now passing it on, getting one of the details slightly wrong in a way that was forgivable. She thought about correcting him and decided not to. He'd get there. This was how knowledge traveled, imperfectly, unevenly, person to person, some of it lost in transmission and some of it gaining something new in the transfer. Her father's knowledge was in this smokehouse now. Not exactly as he'd held it, not perfectly preserved, but alive, moving, being taken in by people who would carry pieces of it forward in their own way. She could live with that. The Halverson meeting happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the storm. James Halverson was 64, built like someone who had spent 40 years doing work that required him to be built that way, with hands that matched and eyes that didn't miss much. He arrived with one man, his ranch manager, a quiet person named Suggs, who said almost nothing the entire time, and who Elena pegged immediately as the one who would actually form the operational opinion, the one you needed to convince. Rowan met them at the gate. Elena was inside the smokehouse when they arrived, which was where she'd told Rowan she'd be, not making an entrance, not positioning herself, just working, because if Halverson was the kind of man she thought he was, finding her actually working would tell him more than any introduction. She heard Rowan's voice outside, the low register he used when he was being careful. She heard Halverson's voice, which was direct without being aggressive. The voice of a man who had been direct for so long it had become his natural register, not a pose. They came in after about 10 minutes. Elena didn't stop working. This is Elena Breyer, Rowan said. She's been running the operation since October. Mr. Halverson, she said. She looked up, nodded, looked back at what she was doing. She finished the cut she was making before she set the tool down and turned properly. Halverson looked at the shelves. He looked at the hanging chamber. He looked at the record on the wall. Then he looked at her. Walsh says you're a drifter, he said. Not cruel. Just stating what he'd heard, watching for what it produced. Walsh doesn't know me, she said. No, Halverson said. He doesn't. He moved to the shelves and looked at the nearest ham without touching it. Mercer says 82%. 82.4, she said. The records are there. She pointed to the stack on the side table. Her 3 record books, the ones Rowan had taken to the meeting and brought back. If you want to go through them. Suggs moved toward the books before Halverson responded. He opened the first one and started reading from the beginning, and Elena watched him without making it obvious. He turned pages at a pace that meant he was actually reading, not skimming. The altitude adjustment, Halverson said. Mercer mentioned that. Standard ratio at sea level doesn't work above 4,000 feet, she said. The cure takes longer and the penetration rate changes. Most people don't account for it specifically. They just add time, which isn't the same thing. What is it specifically? She told him. She kept it clean. The numbers, the reasoning, the results. No excess. She watched Halverson listen the way she watched everything, reading what his face and his posture were telling her. He was a man who had heard a lot of people tell him things, and had developed a reliable filter for the difference between someone who understood something and someone who had memorized the language of understanding it. He asked 3 more questions. They were good questions. She answered them all. Then he said, "Can I taste something?" She took down one of the finished hams. She cut into it in front of him, same as she'd done for Rowan that first time, and she handed him a piece, and she handed Suggs a piece, and she handed Rowan a piece, and she did not take a piece herself because this was not about her. Halverson chewed. He chewed the way a man who knows what he's tasting chews. Not fast, not performing appreciation, just actually tasting. Suggs did not look up from the record book, but he chewed. "Your father taught you this?" Halverson said. "Yes." "Where was his operation?" "Wyoming," she said, "outside Laramie. He ran it for 31 years. "Breyer," Halverson said. "Thomas Breyer?" She went very still. "You knew him?" "I knew of him," Halverson said. "I bought from a man who bought from him. Years ago, before I had my own operation scaled up. He had a particular way with shoulder cuts." He looked at her with something that had shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, but a reassessment, a new placement of information. "That's your inheritance." "Part of it," she said. He looked at the shelves one more time. Then he looked at Rowan. "I'll talk to Doyle," he said. "We can have the spring contract conversation before the month is out." Rowan said, "I'd appreciate that." Halverson said, "Suggs, you done with those records?" Suggs closed the 3rd book. He'd read all 3. He said, "Yes," and handed them back, and Elena took them and added them to the stack without comment. Halverson put on his hat. He stopped at the door and looked at Elena. "Walsh is an idiot," he said, and it was said with such conversational plainness, such complete absence of drama, that it almost didn't register. Then he left. Rowan stood in the smokehouse after they'd gone with a particular expression on his face. Elena put the records back in their place on the shelf. "Suggs read all 3 books," Rowan said. "I know. That's 200 pages. 187, she said. "I know how many pages I wrote." He looked at her. "Your father, Halverson, knew his name." "I heard," she said. "That didn't surprise you?" She thought about it honestly. "My father was good," she said. "Good work travels in ways you don't always track. He never knew how far his name went. He didn't think about it much." She looked at the record books on the shelf. "I think about it now. I think about whether I'm carrying it correctly." "You are," Rowan said. "You don't know enough to judge that," she said, not unkindly. "I know what the shelves look like," he said. "And I know what your father's name produced in a room with James Halverson." He paused. "That's something." She allowed that it was something. The afternoon went quietly. Snow had started again outside, light this time, the patient kind that was going to keep falling until everything was under it. Elena worked until the light failed and then banked the fire and made her notes and locked the smokehouse. She stood outside for a moment in the falling snow. The yard was quiet. The main house had lights in 2 windows. The barn was dark. Somewhere beyond the fence line, the cattle were in the covered shelter Rowan had built them in October, which she knew because she'd watched him spend 3 days on it after the first hard freeze. She thought about the spring contracts. She thought about what Halverson had said about her father. She thought about Suggs reading 187 pages of her records without skipping any of them, which was the most thorough form of respect she could think of. She thought about what came next, which was the question she'd been not quite thinking about for 2 weeks. The work she'd come to do was done. The smokehouse was running, the winter stores were full, the crisis that had brought her here had been averted, and then some. And the machine she'd built would sustain itself through the season with ordinary maintenance, the kind that any of the hands could handle now that she'd taught them what to watch for. She didn't have to leave tomorrow, she didn't have a hard date, but she was aware, in the way you're aware of a season changing, not in one moment but accumulating, that the chapter she'd come here to write had reached its last pages. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the small room off the barn, and she thought about where she'd go next. She thought about it the way she always thought about the next place. Practically, geographically, what kind of operation needed what she had, where the need was. She found, for the first time in several years, that thinking about the next place produced something that was not excitement. She put it aside. She was tired. She'd been tired for weeks in a bone-deep way that required more than sleep to fix. Everything felt more definitive when you were tired. She would think about it when she wasn't. The thing about Rowan Mercer, she'd realized somewhere in the middle weeks of all of this, was that he was not the man she'd first assessed him to be. She'd read him, that first morning at the fence post, as a man who had given up on something without quite admitting it to himself, who had gotten so far into the habit of managing alone that he'd forgotten how to ask the right questions, who was going through the motions of running a ranch while the ranch quietly declined around him. Parts of that were true. But she'd missed other parts. What she'd missed was that his silence, the quality she'd initially read as passivity, was also something else. He was a man who watched, who took things in slowly and then acted on them carefully, sometimes too slowly, but when he acted, it was from a real place, not a performance. The apology about Hector, the conversation with Halverson where he'd let her take the technical questions without trying to answer them himself, the 3 days he'd spent building the cattle shelter before the freeze. He didn't need to be told things were important, he already knew. What he struggled with was the gap between knowing and doing, which was a gap she recognized because it was the gap her father had described in himself once, in a rare moment of self-examination. I know what I should do, Ellie. I just wait too long to do it. She'd watched Rowan narrow that gap over the course of 6 weeks. That was not a small thing. She was in the smokehouse doing the final evening check when Dale came in with his coat still on, which meant he'd come directly from something else without stopping. Rowan's looking for you, he said. Here, she said. Same place I always am. He's been sitting on the porch for 20 minutes, Dale said. Something in his voice was careful in the specific way of people who are trying not to load a sentence with meaning, but are not entirely succeeding. She finished the temperature check. She wrote the reading. She closed the record book and put on her coat and walked across the yard. Rowan was on the porch steps, not drinking coffee, not with anything in his hands, just sitting in the cold in his coat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the mountain. She sat down on the step below him, same position as the first time with the coffee. He said, Halverson called. That was fast, she said. He wants to move the contract conversation up, Rowan said. Next week. He's bringing Doyle. He paused. He wants you there. She was quiet. Specifically, Rowan said, he asked if Elena Breyer would be there. I said I'd ask. The cold had settled in hard. The snow had stopped and the sky had cleared and the stars were the brutal winter kind, bright and distant and indifferent. You'll need to handle more of the technical questions next time, she said. I know, he said. I've been going through the records. She looked at him sideways. Which ones? All 3 books, he said. I borrowed them from the shelf. I've been reading them at night. He said it without making anything of it, like it was simply information. I get most of it. The damper adjustments I'm still working through. She thought about Suggs, reading all 3 books in the smokehouse while Halverson tasted ham. She thought about her father's records, the journals he'd kept for 31 years, which she still had, which lived in her travel bag wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, and how she'd read them for the first time after he died, all of them, and found things in them she hadn't known, gaps in what he'd taught her filled in by what he'd written down. The damper adjustments make more sense if you do them yourself, she said. Come tomorrow morning. I'll walk you through it. Okay, he said. They sat there without talking for a while. The mountain was a dark shape against the stars, enormous and patient, the way mountains are. If the contracts come through, he said, I'll need someone who knows this operation going into the spring season. She didn't answer immediately. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, he said. I just want you to know that's what I'm thinking about. She looked at the smokehouse, the faint line of smoke still rising from the chimney into the cold, clear air, the banked fire doing its slow work through the night, the stores on the shelves that had been nothing 6 weeks ago. What would it look like, she said. A spring season. Whatever you need it to look like, he said. More hands, if you need them. Better tools. A proper room instead of the barn, if you want it. He paused. You could rebuild the operation the way you think it should be, not work around what's here. Start from what you built this winter, and take it further. She was quiet. You've been thinking about leaving, he said. It was not a question. I always think about the next place, she said. That's not new. Is that what you want? He said. The next place? She didn't answer that directly because she wasn't sure of the answer yet, and she wasn't going to give him an uncertain answer dressed up as a certain one. Let me see how the Halverson meeting goes, she said. He nodded. He knew that was not a no. He seemed to understand, with the patience she'd come to recognize in him, that it was also not a yes yet, and that pushing past that would cost more than waiting for it. Tomorrow morning, he said. Damper adjustments. 6 o'clock, she said. Don't be late. He almost smiled. You told Pete the same thing. Pete was on time, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Did I tell you his question the other day? About the chimney strip? He told me himself, she said. Something in Rowan's face, something quiet, something that had to do with more than Pete or chimney strips or altitude ratios, shifted in a way she couldn't quite name, like a man watching something take root that he'd stopped believing could. You're good at this, he said, not meaning the smokehouse. She didn't deflect it. She sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a thing that's true and that you haven't heard said out loud before. I know, she said. My father was better. Maybe, Rowan said, but he's not here. She looked at the mountain. She thought about Thomas Breyer in Wyoming, 31 years of records in a journal she carried wrapped in oilcloth, and what he would think of this porch and this mountain and this ranch and the smokehouse she'd built back to life from its 5 years of rot. She thought he would have liked the altitude adjustment problem, would have sat down with her records and gone through them page by page and said, Here, you did this right. Here, you could have done this differently, with the specific pleasure of a man who loved a problem more than he loved being the only one who could solve it. She stood up. Good night, Rowan, she said. Good night, Elena, he said. She walked back across the yard. The snow crunched under her boots. The smokehouse fire was doing its quiet work. The shelves were full, and the records were right, and somewhere, 12 miles east, James Halverson was probably reading the same 3 books that Suggs had read, and that Rowan had read, and her father's name was moving through this part of Montana in a way Thomas Breyer never knew it would. She went inside. She did not take out her travel bag. She did not start the mental geography of the next place. She went to sleep. Rowan was at the smokehouse door at 5:58 the next morning. Elena was already inside. She heard him check his stride at the door, the small pause of a man who had expected to be early and found himself second. And then he came in without comment and stood at the work table with his coat still on and his hands in his pockets, waiting. She showed him the damper without preamble. She walked him through the logic of it, not the mechanics, which were simple, but the reasoning behind each adjustment, the way the damper position changed the relationship between air intake and smoke density, the way that relationship affected temperature, and temperature affected the cure at different stages. She explained it the way her father had explained things to her, not by telling her what to do, but by telling her why, so that when the situation changed, she'd know how to think about it, rather than just which lever to pull. Rowan listened the way he'd listened to her from the beginning, fully, without interrupting, occasionally asking a question that showed he'd understood the previous point and was building from it. He was not, she'd learned, a quick study in the sense of fast. He was a slow study in the sense of thorough. Things went in, and they stayed. Try it, she said, stepping back from the damper. He adjusted it. Wrong, slightly. Too far in the direction of restriction, which would cool the chamber faster than ideal at this stage of the morning cycle. Half a turn back, she said. He corrected it. Like that? She checked the strip. Close. Give it 10 minutes and we'll see where the temperature lands. They waited. She went back to her morning checks and he stood near the damper and watched the strip gauge with the focused attention of someone taking a test they want to pass. After 8 minutes, he said, It's still climbing. I know, she said. That's correct. You want it to climb for another 4 minutes before it levels. And if it doesn't level? Then we adjust again, she said. It's not one decision, it's continuous. He absorbed that. She watched him file it in whatever place he was building for this knowledge, separate from the practical ranching knowledge he'd accumulated over 20 years, a new room being constructed adjacent to the existing ones. Your father taught you this the same way? He said. He taught me by making me do it, she said. He'd give me the damper at 5 in the morning and go have his coffee and come back at 6 and ask me what I'd found. I got it wrong for 2 weeks straight. Did he tell you when you were wrong? He asked me questions until I figured it out myself, she said, which I hated. She paused, and which meant I never forgot it once I got it. Rowan was quiet for a moment. That's a specific kind of patience, he said. He had it, she said. I'm still working on it. He looked at her. She hadn't intended the admission. It came out simply, factually, the way true things sometimes did when you weren't managing yourself carefully enough. She didn't take it back. You have more of it than you think, he said. She handed him the record book. Temperature reading, she said. Write it down. He wrote it down. He had her handwriting style in his head already. She could see him trying to match the format, the column structure she used, and he got it close enough that the record would make sense to anyone who read it after. That was the thing she hadn't expected to feel, the specific quality of watching someone else be careful with your work, not taking it over, not improving on it, just being careful with it. It was different from being thanked. It was more particular than that. What? The Halverson meeting happened the following Thursday, same as planned. Halverson brought Doyle this time, a quieter man than she'd expected, 50s, with a way of listening that reminded her of her father's listening, that quality of someone whose mind was working faster than their face showed. And Suggs was back, which she'd anticipated. Suggs was the variable she'd been thinking about most. In her experience, the person who read everything carefully at the first meeting and said nothing was the person whose opinion actually determined the outcome. They met in the main house kitchen, which was Rowan's suggestion, and which she thought was the right one. Not the smokehouse. The smokehouse was the proof. And you didn't open with the proof. You built to it. The kitchen was neutral ground, a room where business could happen without either side performing. Elena had made coffee. She'd also made a point of being at the table when they arrived, already seated, with her record books in front of her, and a clean pad of paper to one side. Not presenting herself, just present. Halverson shook Rowan's hand and then Elena's. Doyle did the same. Suggs nodded, which from Suggs meant something. We looked at the records you left, Halverson said to Rowan. She kept them, Rowan said, which was exactly the right thing to say. Halverson looked at Elena. The altitude adjustment you described last time. Doyle has a question about the application at his elevation. What's your elevation? She said to Doyle. Doyle told her. She did the math out loud, slowly enough that Rowan could follow it, explaining the specific modification, why it differed from her own ratio by a factor she explained in terms of the density of the air and the rate of salt draw that resulted. Doyle listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered them. Halfway through the second answer, she noticed Suggs was writing. Not taking formal notes, just jotting, the way people jot when they want to hold something until they can think about it more carefully. She kept talking and didn't let herself register any satisfaction about that until later. The conversation went for 2 hours. At the end of it, Halverson leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who has made a decision and is organizing how to present it. Mercer Ranch gets the spring contracts, he said. Both operations, mine and Doyle's. Volume and terms to be worked out, but the agreement is there. He looked at Rowan. Contingent on one thing. Rowan waited. The smokehouse continues to operate the way it did this winter, Halverson said. He looked at Elena. Which means she needs to be here in the spring. The kitchen was quiet. Rowan kept his face neutral, which she appreciated, because the wrong expression from him in that moment would have complicated things. That's a conversation for us to have, Rowan said. Privately. Halverson nodded. Fair enough, fair enough. Get it settled before the month is out, and we'll sit down on the terms. He pushed back his chair. Suggs, you got everything? Suggs closed his notebook. Yes, he said. Halverson put on his coat. He stopped at the kitchen door and looked at Elena one more time. Your father's operation in Laramie, he said. Did he keep records the way you do? 31 years of them, she said. Those records still exist? They're in my bag, she said. Something crossed Halverson's face. Not quite surprise, but the recalibration of a man who has just realized the thing he thought was one thing is actually something larger. You carry them with you. They're all I have left of him, she said. It came out plain, without self-pity, just as information. Halverson looked at her for a moment. Take care of those, he said. I do, she said. He left. Doyle left. Suggs left last, and at the door he paused and looked back at Elena and said, The 2-point chimney measurement. That was in the records. Smart design. And then he was gone before she could respond, which was exactly the kind of compliment she respected most. Said and done, no lingering. Rowan stood at the kitchen window and watched them ride out. He didn't speak until they were gone from sight. Contingent on you, he said. I heard, she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the direct quality that had become his mode with her. Not calculated, not performing confidence, just looking. What do you need from me to make this work? He said. She'd been thinking about it. She'd been thinking about it since the porch conversation, since she'd gone to sleep without taking out her travel bag. She'd been turning it over in the particular way she turned over decisions, not rushing toward an answer but not avoiding it either, just letting it develop at the pace it needed. Not a wage, she said. I've been thinking about that. A wage is the wrong structure. He waited. A partnership, she said. Not the whole ranch. I don't want the whole ranch. But the smokehouse operation, the curing and the preservation, and the contracts that come from it, equal split on what that generates. He looked at her steadily. You want to own part of the operation. I want to own the part I built, she said. The way it works now, if I leave, the knowledge leaves with me. You'd be back to where you were in October. That's not good for you, and it's not the right way to structure this. She paused. A partnership means I'm invested in it being successful beyond this winter. It means I'm here because I have something to protect, not because I'm working a season. And Pete, he said, and Dale, what they've learned. Stays, she said. That's part of what I'm protecting. The operation isn't just me. It's what I've built here, including what they can do now. He was quiet. She could see him doing the math, the financial math, but also the other kind, the assessment of what this meant beyond the numbers, what it changed about the nature of this place and his relationship to it. Walsh is going to say I sold part of my ranch to the woman I hired to salt pork, he said. Walsh is going to say something unpleasant no matter what you do, she said. That's been established. Something flickered in his expression. That's true. The question is whether what Walsh says affects what Halverson does, she said. And based on today, I think we know the answer to that. He looked at the table. He looked at her record book sitting there, 3 volumes of the winter's work, and at the clean pad of paper beside them where she'd made a few notes during the meeting. Equal split on the smokehouse contracts, he said slowly. You manage the operation, you make the operational decisions, you own the methodology. Yes. And you're here through spring, through the next winter, if the contracts hold. If the structure is right, she said, I'm here as long as the work is here. He looked up from the table. What does that mean? She thought about how to say it honestly. It means I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I've had that situation before and it doesn't end well. I'm staying because this is worth staying for. She paused. That's a different foundation. And it means if something stops working, I need to be able to say so. And I need to be able to hear it, he said. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. He wasn't doing the thing she'd seen some men do when they arrived at a negotiation outcome, the performance of reluctant acceptance, the theatrical pause that was really just status management. He was actually thinking, and when he was done thinking, he said, That's a fair structure. I think so too, she said. He reached across the table and extended his hand. She looked at it. She shook it. His hand was rough the same way her father's had been rough. Not from neglect, but from use, from the specific damage of decades of work that left the skin thick and mapped in a way that told you something about the person before they said a word. We should write it down, she said. We should, he said. I'll get paper. They wrote it down that afternoon, the two of them at the kitchen table with no lawyer and no witness except the winter light coming through the window. It was not a legal document in any formal sense. It was a page and a half of plain language that said what they'd agreed to, signed at the bottom by both of them, with a date and a description of the operation clear enough that anyone reading it would understand what was meant. Elena kept a copy. Rowan kept a copy. She folded hers and put it in her travel bag beside her father's journals wrapped in oilcloth. She stood there for a moment with the bag open, looking at the journals. 31 years of Thomas Breyer's handwriting, his ratios and his adjustments, and his failures and his corrections, the record of everything he'd learned in a life of work that nobody but Elena had thought to save. She closed the bag. She went back to the smokehouse. She told Dale first because Dale had earned it. She told him plainly, no ceremony, the spring contracts, the partnership, what it meant for the operation going forward. He listened with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was processing something he hadn't expected. Partner, he said, as if checking that he'd heard right. On the smokehouse operation, she said. Not the cattle, not the land. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Margaret would have liked that. She hadn't expected that. It landed somewhere specific. Tell me about her, she said. If you want, you don't have to. He looked at the east rack, the one with the new hooks, all solid now, the rack that could hold a proper load without dropping it. She was practical, he said. Like you. Not the same way, different background, but the same. She didn't waste words. She knew what she knew, and she knew what she didn't. He paused. She kept this place alive for a long time by herself, in the ways Rowan didn't see. And then she ran out of capacity to do it, and she left, and I don't blame her. He looked at Elena. I blamed myself for a while, for not doing more. Like you said about the smokehouse, she said. Like I said, he said. She let that sit. She's in Colorado, Dale said. Has her own thing now, I hear. Garden, some kind of small enterprise. She did all right. Good, Elena said, and meant it. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the shelves. What do you need first for the spring planning? That was Dale. He moved through things and came out the other side into the practical, which was where he was most comfortable. She respected that. It was where she was most comfortable, too. An assessment of what we have left when winter breaks, she said, and a conversation about what the Halverson and Doyle volume is going to require by way of additional capacity. More hanging space, he said immediately. More hanging space, she agreed, and better drainage in the floor. I've been working around the drainage problem since October and it's manageable, but it's not right. I can fix the drainage, he said. Come spring, when the ground opens up. I know you can, she said. He almost smiled. He didn't quite, but it was the closest she'd seen. She told Pete that afternoon. He was at the chimney strip doing the afternoon check. She'd given him the morning and afternoon checks as regular responsibility 2 weeks ago, and he hadn't missed one. And she told him while he was reading the gauge, which was intentional. She wanted him in the middle of the work when she told him, not standing around. Partnership, he said. Partnership, she confirmed. He looked at the strip. Temperature's right, he said, and wrote it in the sublog she'd started for him. Then, does that mean you're going to be here telling me I'm wrong about things for the foreseeable future? Probably, she said. Okay, he said. He didn't make anything of it. He was 20 years younger than she was, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with that dynamic, and he probably never would be. But he'd decided it was worth it, and that was enough. She told Hector last. She found him at the east pasture fence, a different fence from the one Rowan had been fighting that first morning, but the same quality of work, the same particular kind of maintenance that a ranch requires in endless rotation. He didn't stop working when she came over. She stood on the other side of the fence and told him. When she finished, he drove one more post and didn't say anything for a moment. Walsh won't like it, he said. Walsh doesn't like most things, she said. He'll come at the ranch over it, Hector said. He'll make noise. I know, she said. You're ready for that? He said. Are you? She said. He looked at her across the fence. I've been on this ranch 9 years, he said. Walsh has been making noise about Mercer Ranch for half of that. Doesn't seem to have accomplished much. No, she said. It doesn't. He drove another post. You're going to fix the drainage in the smokehouse floor, he said. Spring. I can help with that, he said. I know where the problem starts. It's outside the building, not inside. The grade runs toward the foundation. She looked at him. You knew that this whole time? Didn't seem like my department, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. The specific tone of a man who is aware of the irony in what he's saying. It's your department now, she said. He nodded, once, the way Hector nodded. With his whole upper body, a short, decisive movement, the gesture of a man who had given his word. She walked back to the ranch. The first week of December brought a storm that was bigger than the October one. 3 days of it, the kind of snow that changed the shape of the land, that covered the fences to their tops, and made the road to Callow Creek impassable for 36 hours. They were ready for it. Not because of luck, but because of 6 weeks of preparation that had been done correctly, against resistance, by someone who knew what she was doing. The smokehouse held. The stores held. The hands knew their jobs, which meant Elena wasn't fighting the storm alone inside the building while people slept. Pete ran the temperature checks through the first night. Dale managed the morning cycles on the second day when Elena finally slept past 6 for the first time since October. Hector cleared the snow load from the roof on the third morning without being asked, which was the kind of thing that didn't require acknowledgement but received it anyway. She told him it was the right call, and he said he knew, and they moved on. Rowan was in the smokehouse the afternoon the storm broke, the way he'd been in the smokehouse most afternoons since the damper lesson. He'd progressed, not to her level, but to a level of functional understanding that meant the operation didn't live entirely inside her head anymore. He could read the records and understand what they said. He could make the basic temperature adjustments. He could identify the difference between a cure that was going right and one that needed attention. If she got sick or hurt or was absent for any reason, the operation could continue. That had been one of her conditions, unstated, since the beginning. Not a condition of the partnership agreement. She hadn't written it down. Just a personal requirement. She would not build something that died when she left the room. Halverson's road will be open tomorrow, Rowan said, checking the temperature strip. He'd developed the habit of checking it when he came in, which she found she didn't mind. Probably, she said. He'll be in contact about the spring terms. I know. He made the note in the sublog, temperature, time, damper position, in handwriting that had gotten neater over the past 2 weeks. He wasn't trying to match her format anymore. He'd developed his own variation of it, which was the right development. I want to talk to you about the building itself, he said. She looked up. The smokehouse, he said. The structure. Come spring. When the ground opens, I want to rebuild the north wall properly. It's been losing heat at the upper seam for years. I can see it now in the temperature variance on cold days. And I want to raise the roof line by 18 inches to give better vertical space for the hanging chamber. He paused. If you're going to run the volume that Halverson and Doyle represent, you need more room. She looked at the north wall. She'd known about the heat loss. She'd been compensating for it since October, adjusting the fire to account for what the wall gave away, accepting it as a fixed condition. She hadn't thought of it as something to solve because it hadn't been her building to solve. It was her building now. The roof line is the right call, she said. The wall, yes, but the foundation on that side needs to be checked before we build up. If the frost got under it, raising the wall without addressing that first makes it worse. Hector said the same thing, he said. She blinked. You talked to Hector about the foundation. This morning, Rowan said. He knows this property better than I do in some ways, 9 years of watching things. She thought about Hector at the east pasture fence, driving posts with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. 9 years of showing up. 9 years of holding things together in the ways he could, and watching them fall apart in the ways he couldn't, and never quite saying so in a way that could be heard. He's good, she said. He is, Rowan said, and then, after a pause, I should have told him that more. She didn't respond to that. It was between Rowan and Hector, and it would get handled or it wouldn't, and her job was not to manage every relationship on this ranch, only to be honest in the ones that were hers. Spring rebuild then, she said. I'll draft what I need for the hanging chamber before the ground opens. Good, he said. They worked in quiet for a while. Outside, the storm had left the world white and still. The particular stillness that only comes after 3 days of wind and noise, when everything is done being moved and has landed where it's going to be. She thought about what her father would make of this. Not the partnership specifically. He'd been a private man with a practical mind, and he'd probably just ask about the terms. But the broader thing. The fact that his knowledge was here, in this building, in these records, and in the hands of people who'd learned it from her. That it had survived him by 10 years and was still going. She'd never been the kind of person who believed knowledge was something you possessed. Her father had taught her to think of it differently, as something you were trusted with, temporarily, that needed to be passed on before it could be taken from you. Everything he'd known had come from someone before him, and everything she knew had come from him, and what she did with it determined whether it went any further. Pete would carry some of it, Dale, in his own way. Even Hector, once the spring build gave him the foundation problem to think about. She'd find ways to bring him in on the reasoning, the same way her father had brought her in on things that weren't obviously her department. That was the work. Not the salt or the smoke or the fire. The work was making sure the thing didn't die with you. Walsh came in person in the second week of December. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected more at a distance. The comments in town, the pressure on the contracts, the low-level campaign of attrition he'd been running since October. She hadn't expected him to drive out to Mercer Ranch on a cold Wednesday afternoon and knock on the main house door like an ordinary visitor. Rowan answered. She was at the smokehouse and could see the exchange from the window. Rowan on the porch, Walsh below him. Two men whose conversation had the quality of something that had been overdue. She didn't go to the window. She went back to work. 20 minutes later, Rowan came to the smokehouse. His jaw had the tension in it, but it was different from the tension she'd first seen. Less the tension of a man being pressed, and more the tension of a man who has just said something that needed saying and is still feeling the shape of it in his mouth. Walsh came to make an offer, Rowan said. She waited. He wants to buy the smokehouse operation, Rowan said. Not the ranch, just the operation, the contracts, the methodology, whatever he'd need to replicate it. He paused. He wants to hire you directly, through him. She looked at him. He came here to poach. Yes? What did you say? I said no, Rowan said. I said the operation isn't mine to sell because it isn't solely mine. He paused again. He didn't know about this partnership. His face when I told him was, he didn't know. She thought about that. About Walsh arriving with what he'd assumed was a simple business proposition. Buy out the thing you want, neutralize the threat, acquire the asset, and leave the damaged ranch to its damage. And then finding out the asset was no longer an asset to acquire, that it had already become something else. What did he say? She said. He asked who authorized the partnership, Rowan said. I told him we authorized it. He said a ranch owner partnering with a hired hand wasn't something you could just... He stopped. He used some language I won't repeat. She could imagine it. I told him to get off my property, Rowan said. She looked at him. I said it once, Rowan said. He went. She turned that over. I said it once. Not twice. Not after a long discussion or a negotiation or the kind of slow escalation she'd watched him avoid all autumn. Once because it needed saying, and then it was done. You're getting better at that, she said. At telling people to leave my property? At saying the thing once, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Walsh isn't finished, he said. That visit wasn't a surrender. It was reconnaissance. I know, she said. He found out the structure. Now he's going to think about how to work around it. Can he? She thought about it honestly. He can make noise, she said. He can try to pressure Halverson and Doyle. He can be unpleasant in town. What he can't do is undo what's already been built here. She looked at the shelves. The Halverson contracts exist because of what those records show and what this product is. Walsh can talk about whatever he wants. He can't change what's in those jars or what's on those shelves or what Suggs wrote in his notebook. Rowan nodded. Not with relief. She'd noticed he didn't reach for relief the way some people did, as a destination. He reached for the next clear thing. Spring build, he said. Sooner we start planning, the better. Agreed, she said. He left to find Hector, and she turned back to the work table, and the smokehouse was warm in the way it had been warm since that first night she'd rebuilt the fire against the arriving frost. Earned warmth, worked for warmth, the warmth of a fire that someone had tended through the difficult hours and kept burning. January settled over the valley like a deliberate thing. Not gradual. January in that part of Montana was never gradual, but with the specific authority of a season that knew its own power and wasn't interested in negotiation. The road to Callow Creek froze solid. The cattle pressed together in their shelter. The mornings went dark until 8, and the evenings went dark at 4, and in between there was white and cold, and the particular quality of winter silence that was not peaceful so much as it was absolute. Mercer Ranch was fed. Not abundantly, not with luxury, but fed in the specific way that matters, methodically, correctly, from stores that had been built with attention and would last the season. The smokehouse ran its daily cycle. The temperature records filled another book. Pete did the morning checks without fail. Dale knew what he was looking at when he walked through. Hector fixed a small issue with the chimney draft in the second week of January, identified it himself, solved it without asking, and told Elena about it afterward, which was the right sequence. Rowan came to the smokehouse most evenings. They talked, sometimes about the operation, sometimes about the spring build, sometimes about nothing particular. He'd stopped standing in the doorway. He came in and sat down, and the building was as much his space as any other space on the ranch, which was how it should be. One evening in the third week of January, he said, "The room off the barn." She looked up from the records. "It's not a proper room," he said. "It's a storage space with a bunk in it." He said it the way he said things he'd been considering for a while, not tentatively, just carefully. "There's a room in the main house, second floor, south-facing. It's been empty since Margaret left." He paused. "It's a proper room." She looked at him. He looked back without any particular expression. "I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "It's a practical offer," he said. "You're a partner in this operation. You should have a proper room." She thought about the travel bag under the bunk in the barn room, the oilcloth-wrapped journals, the copy of the partnership agreement folded next to them. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take your time," he said. She moved her things on a Saturday. It took 20 minutes because she didn't have much. The room was south-facing, and in the morning it caught the light in a way the barn room never had. A broad, flat light that came in clean off the snow and filled the space without drama. There was a window seat that someone had built at some point, deep enough to sit in, with a view of the valley and the mountain, and at an angle, the smokehouse roof. She put her father's journals on the shelf above the desk. She put the partnership agreement in the desk drawer. She put her coat on the hook behind the door. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. It was a room. A proper one, as Rowan had said. A room that belonged to someone who had a reason to stay in it. She'd had rooms before, in Laramie, in Billings, in the 3 other ranches she'd worked over the years. She'd moved out of all of them without looking back, because the work was done and the next place was ahead, and she'd never given herself permission to put anything on a shelf that she couldn't pack in 20 minutes. She looked at her father's journals on the shelf. She'd pack those every time, too. She'd carry them everywhere until she died, she supposed. That was different from staying. That was just the obligation you took on when you were the last person who cared about someone else's knowledge. But the journals looked different on a shelf than they looked in a bag. On a shelf they looked like they'd arrived somewhere. She sat in the window seat and looked at the valley and the mountain and the distant line of the smokehouse roof with its thin thread of smoke rising into the January sky. The smoke meant the fire was right. The fire being right meant the cure was running correctly. The cure running correctly meant the stores would hold. That was the chain of it. That was always the chain of it. She'd been following that chain since she was 7 years old, and it had led her through Wyoming and Billings and 3 other ranches, and a year of not knowing where it was leading, and now it had led here, to this room, this view, this partnership built on a page and a half of plain language and a handshake in a kitchen. She didn't know how long it would hold. She'd learned enough about ranching and enough about people to know that nothing held forever, that partnerships soured and winters were bad, and the economy of a small operation could be undone by a single season's catastrophe. She knew that. She also knew that the worst version of the future was better faced from a place you'd built something in than from a road between places. Her father had told her that once. She'd argued with him about it when she was young and restless, and certain that movement was the same as progress. She'd understood it the year he died, when there was no argument left to have, when understanding came too late for him to know she'd gotten there. She was here now. That was enough. In February, Halverson and Doyle signed the spring contracts. The terms were good, not extravagant, but fair and sustainable. The kind of terms that represented a real agreement between people who planned to keep doing business with each other, rather than the kind that represented someone getting the better of someone else and banking on them not noticing until it was too late. Elena reviewed the numbers. She suggested 2 modifications. Rowan brought them back to Halverson. Halverson accepted one and negotiated the other to a middle position that Elena, privately, thought was actually better than what she'd proposed. She told Rowan that. He looked slightly amused. "You're not bothered that he negotiated you down?" "He negotiated to a better position," she said. "That's not the same as down." He thought about that. "Fair," he said. Walsh did not disappear. He made a comment in Callow Creek about the contracts that Francis Pruitt relayed to Elena with the specific expression of someone who feels obligated to report unpleasant news and wishes they didn't. The comment was about the impropriety of the arrangement, about what people in the valley would make of it, about the kind of woman who attached herself to a struggling operation and the kind of man who let her. Elena thanked Francis for telling her. She went back to the ranch and she wrote the February temperature records, and she did the afternoon checks, and she thought about Walsh exactly long enough to decide that she was not going to spend any more of her time thinking about Walsh. He was a man who had decided the outcome before the game started, the way her father used to say. And the outcome had not gone his way. He would make noise about that for as long as making noise felt like it cost the other person something. The moment it stopped costing anything, he'd find somewhere else to direct his energy. She would just have to be patient until that moment came. Rowan dealt with Walsh differently. He dealt with him by being visible, in town, at the feed store, at the one gathering of Eastern ranchers in late January where Walsh made his presence felt. He didn't argue, he didn't defend, he brought the spring contract figures and he talked about the operation in the specific language of results, and he let the numbers speak in a room full of people who understood numbers. Walsh left that gathering early. She heard about it from Dale, who heard about it from Cal, who had been there because he'd driven Rowan's wagon. The chain of information on a ranch was its own kind of infrastructure. Walsh left before the meal, Dale said. Rowan stayed the whole time. Good, she said. He said something, Dale said. At the end, when people were saying goodnight, Rowan said, Cal said he said, I owe the success of this winter to my partner, Elena Breyer, who came to this ranch with more knowledge in her hands than most of us have in our whole operations. Dale paused. In front of everyone. She set down the tool she was holding. Cal said Halverson nodded, Dale said. And Doyle. And 3 or 4 of the others. She picked the tool back up. She kept working. She thought about Rowan in that room saying her name and saying partner and saying knowledge in her hands. And she thought about the 12-year-old girl in Wyoming who had stood at her father's shoulder and been invisible to every man in every room they walked into, and the 22-year-old in Billings who'd done the work and watched someone else take the credit, and the 35-year-old on the road between places who'd started to wonder if the knowledge she carried had any destination left. And she thought that some debts didn't get paid directly, that sometimes the thing owed to you didn't come from the person who owed it, but arrived anyway, through a different door, in a different form, delivered by someone who didn't know they were settling a very old account. She'd take it. It was real, and it was hers, and she'd take it. On the last day of February, she walked out to the smokehouse at dusk. Not to work. She'd done the checks. Pete had done the afternoon cycle. The fire was banked correctly, and the temperature was where it needed to be, and the stores were running down in the ordinary way of winter's end. Not depleted, not desperate, just diminishing at the rate she'd calculated they would, which meant they would last until the thaw with weeks to spare. She stood inside and looked at the shelves. She looked at the record books on the side table, 4 of them now, the 4th only half full, the rest of the winter's entries waiting to be written. She looked at the hooks on the east rack, solid and straight, the ones she'd replaced in the first week. She looked at the floor drain she'd been managing around for 4 months, and that Hector was going to fix come spring, starting from the outside in. She looked at the temperature strip on the chimney, Pete's domain now, the thing he'd asked her about with the specific shyness of someone who doesn't want to admit they're interested, the small design her father would have recognized as his own, carried forward in a form he never saw. The smokehouse smelled right. It smelled the way it was supposed to smell, the way it had not smelled in 5 years before she arrived. It smelled like work done correctly over time, like patience and salt, and the particular chemistry of wood smoke and cured meat, which was not a romantic smell but was an honest one, and she had always preferred honest smells to romantic ones. She heard the door behind her. Rowan came in. He looked at the shelves the same way she'd been looking at them, taking them in, the full account of the winter. February's almost done, he said. Almost, she said. He came to stand beside her, not close, not distant, just beside her, looking at the same thing. You came here in October, he said, with a travel bag. I did, she said. And now it's February, he said, and the shelves are full. She looked at the shelves. They're not full, she said. They're appropriately depleted for this point in the season. Full would mean we overstocked, which wastes resources. He was quiet for a moment, then, You're impossible to be sentimental around. The math is the math, she said. Elena, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you came through that gate, he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was not performing anything. He was just saying a true thing in the direct way he'd learned, or relearned, or found again after losing it somewhere in the last 5 years. So am I, she said. They stood there in the warm smokehouse with the fire working and the winter outside doing its last weeks of work before it let go, and the valley below them was white and still, and 12 miles east. Halverson's ranch was planning for spring, and the spring contracts were signed, and the north wall was going to be rebuilt correctly, and the floor drain was going to be fixed from the outside in, and the roof would go up 18 inches to give the hanging chamber room to grow. There was a lot of work ahead. That was the best thing she knew how to say about a life. That there was good work ahead, and people worth doing it with, and the knowledge to do it right. The smokehouse fire burned steady through the night, the way it had burned every night since October, tended by hands that knew what they were doing and would keep knowing for seasons to come. Outside, the valley held its winter quiet. Inside, the work went on.